Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's ESOP Centre FS Club webinar. I am Ian Harris, your host for the day, and I'm delighted once again to introduce David Craddock from David Craddock Consultancy Services, who's going to be talking to us today on the role of direct employee share ownership in market economics. Next slide, please. So I am Ian Harris, Managing Director of the Xian Group, as the slide says. You could have read that. I needn't have said anything. Next slide, please. We're very grateful to the members and sponsors of the ESOP Centre, and this is a list of those organisations, for enabling us to do this webinar programme and to make it available to everybody, not just to members, but to anyone who wants to sign up. Without these sponsors and members, none of this would be possible, we're just very grateful for the opportunity to offer the program. So thank you to our sponsors. Next slide, please. Here are some more sponsors. These are mostly Vantage Club and FS Club sponsors on this list. We've gone to the next slide without me saying anything. Excellent. Today's agenda, my introduction is billed for 5 minutes, but I promise you it won't be as long as that. And we will then have a keynote presentation from David Craddock for about 20 or 25 minutes. There should be plenty of time for questions and answers, I hope. So just on the matter of questions and answers, we are sort of hermetically sealed inside the GoToWebinar world. So please send us your questions through the GoToWebinar questions system, and we will see them. I will try to get as many of those questions asked and answered during the time that we're together here as possible. If we can't get through all of the questions, David very kindly is always happy to take a look at the questions that come in and get back to you individually. But if you want your question asked live and online, please do that within the GoToWebinar world. We won't see anything that sits outside this world until after the webinar. Next slide, please. It's just beholden on me to introduce David, and I'm always delighted to do so. This must be maybe the 10th, 15th time I've introduced David at one of these ESOP Centre.
I think actually 17th, yeah.
It feels like only 10 or 15. Well, David is an independent consultant. He specializes in employee share ownership and reward management. And he is really one of the world's leading authorities on this matter. He is also the author of the Tolley's Guide to Employee Share Schemes, one of those page-turning books that if you don't have it by your bedside, you really should if you're an employee share ownership person, or ideally on your shelf to reach and refer to when you're doing some work more seriously. David has successfully established employee share schemes and employee benefit arrangements all around the world, and has travelled himself to over 30 countries to facilitate their introduction. So he really is an ideal person to talk to us on this subject. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to today's speaker, David Craddock. Next slide, please.
Well, thank you, Ian. That's my introduction slide. Just a word that I've provided copious notes for you, absolutely copious notes for you to read at your own leisure. So I understand that these notes can be made available to you for you to read in your own time. And any questions which emerge, do let me know. I'll be very keen to enter into dialogue with you. So let's go to the next slide. A little bit more about me, emphasizing the title, which is the role of direct employee share ownership in market economics. And what I'm wanting to do really during this webinar is to identify the natural fit between direct employee share ownership and market economics, and most explicitly the social market economy. So let's go to the next slide. So I've begun the slides of substance with a reference to one-time Labour politician Anthony Crossland. And it's indicative really as to how far we've come with the development of market economics since the 1970s. In 1974, in his landmark book, as it was at the time, Socialism Now, Anthony Crossland wrote, "I see no reason to alter the revisionist thesis that government can generally impose its will, provided it has one, on the private corporation. And in 1950, some 24 years earlier, he'd already written that Britain has in all essentials ceased to be a capitalist economy. So what I'm going to demonstrate really throughout this presentation is that both those assertions are wrong. And indeed, the flaw in Crosland's thinking lies not in an inability to identify poorly constructed political infrastructures, such that they are, but in failing to appreciate the unchanging nature of the human condition. He fails to appreciate the nature of the human spirit in its personal and in its social need for the combination of freedom, incentive, and reward, which cannot be unleashed when you're working with a totalitarian system that seeks to impose its will upon the population. So the lessons of history that Crosland had failed to learn, and they're much more apparent now in 2024 than they were in 1974, are firstly that subjugation of private initiative and endeavour to state control has the effect of stifling the human instinct that gives rise to any private resolve. Secondly, that enforced state control can only be sustained through colossal artificial infrastructures, and only then over the comparatively short term. So witness there, for example, the socialism in one country type philosophy that Stalin imposed in order to protect what he understood to be a Marxist-Leninist philosophy. And thirdly, that ultimately the positive and natural instincts of human beings will rise up initially in defiance and then subsequently in positive and constructive endeavour. So what I'm going to demonstrate is that employee share ownership, working with the social market economy, working with market economics, is something completely different in kind from any totalitarian system of imposed governmental will. So let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, the next slide. Thank you. Yes. So direct employee share ownership mirroring the I think we just got hopped one too many there. Yeah, direct employee share ownership mirroring market economics modeling. So what I'm saying here really is that direct employee share ownership is an archetypal form of market economics. But what I'm seeking to demonstrate is that it's a very particular type of market economics, which has very, very profound and serious advantages of wonderful consequence potentially to the development of prosperity in our nation and indeed worldwide. And as a kick-off, really, I've identified a couple of key features here which I want to bring to your attention for direct employee share ownership as a market mechanism. And the first really is as a discovery mechanism. So what do I mean by that? Well, a discovery mechanism within human resource management. Employee share ownership is an element within human resource management. It works best when it works alongside compatible human resource policies like training and development, like delegation and decision taking, like works councils and works committees, like quality circles and suggestion boxes. And employee share ownership welds itself with those policies in order to discover the best in a human being. So that's what I mean by discovery mechanism. That of course is all predicated upon the policies being properly implemented, properly communicated, properly developed by an aware group of directors, an aware group of leaders within the business. But properly done, it will bring out the best of employees, and it will actually enable the company to fine tune its dealings with particular employees in order to bring the best out of them. Secondly, as well as the discovery mechanism, I've identified what I call a self-regulatory mechanism. So there is a self-regulatory capacity inherent within direct employee share ownership that's different in kind from the impositional imperatives of totalitarianism, whether it be socialism or totalitarianism of any type, whatever it might be in terms of its centralization and its dictatorship. The self-regulatory nature lies in the fact that the disposition of shares to employees gives them freedom to think and to respond to that shareholding in the way that they choose. And different people will answer the challenge of employee share ownership in different ways. And that's why it's a self-regulatory mechanism, because collectively and individually, it will correct positions within the attitudinal responses of employees as they seek to make their contribution to the company. So direct employee share ownership, both as a discovery mechanism and as a self-regulator, it acts in the same way as a mature, responsible and flexible market. It is truly mature, responsible and flexible. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So, the compatibility with the social market economic model. There is a natural compatibility between employee shares ownership and the social market economic model. The employee share ownership model essentially comes out of the US, with the prime thinkers being Louis Kelso and Martin Weitzman. More of them later. The social market economy, in the main, comes out of Europe, and in particular Germany. You might therefore ask, well, why is there not more employee share ownership in Germany as a consequence, if they are a natural fit? The short answer is the domination of German companies by families, but that's another story and a subject for another discourse. Suffice to say that in terms of my own personal research, I see a direct natural compatibility between employee share ownership and the social market economy. But both are concerned about an individual response, but they're also concerned about a collective response, a team response, and therefore a social response. So when I say why and how, the answer is that this marriage of the individual self-sufficiency, the individual reward, the individual self-reliance, that marries at the same time with a collective cohesion, a team response required to deliver the employee share scheme response, and indeed required to deliver the benefits of the social market economy, where all work together in harmony with good industrial relations, all contributing to a growing national economy. Now, on this slide, I've said something about redistribution. When you look at how redistribution historically took place in Britain, and indeed to some degree still does, through governmental handouts and social security, you see how advanced employee share ownership is in achieving the same aim, but not through handouts or social security benefits, but through hard work and application. Yes, that employee share ownership, by its inclusiveness, and indeed that's also a feature of the social market economy, by its inclusiveness, it enables a redistribution of wealth, but on the basis of hard work, endeavour, application, and a belief in the market system to deliver that redistribution to everybody according to their contribution. Few things I've said about traditional redistributionist theory, which is probably worthwhile bringing out here. That the first four is that by dispensing gifts through social security that are not related to effort or contribution, the tendency on the part of the receiver, the donee as I call it, is a failure to attach value. The second flaw is that by discouraging the individual who aspires to be a millionaire, or a multimillionaire for that matter, you're also discouraging the individual who aspires to a fraction of that amount. So we have a much more progressive approach in employee share ownership, particularly when married with that social market economy. And to a large degree, that is what has happened in the United Kingdom since the Thatcher years, moving through the Blair and Brown years into the coalition. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is a sort of summary slide at this point. The responsibility consequence of direct employee share ownership. The responsibility consequence. So direct employee share ownership encourages responsibility. Yeah, it teaches responsibility in encouraging personal contribution and in celebrating personal reward, but also in encouraging team or corporate or social contribution, in celebrating team reward, and in being aware of corporate or social need. And therefore, if properly encouraged by a company within its community, moving on to wider civic responsibility, the personal responsibility dynamic of direct employee share ownership. And I emphasize direct employee share ownership, where the employees have a direct share interest in the capital of the company in which they work. Let's go to the next slide, thanks. Yeah. Okay. So the alternative democracy in the corporate world through direct employee share ownership. Now, what I want to say here really is that Anthony Crossland very definitely got it wrong. That in this world where there's almost an apathy over elections, whether they be local elections, and to some degree over general elections, companies can encourage the very reverse by attaching employee votes to shares or share interest which employees have in the companies in which they work. And I've got another webinar coming up later this year on the employee voice, the employee vote, a benefit which is often fought shy of by management. I don't know why, because the employees will typically always be in the minority anyway, but give them that voice and they will take it. And so what we get to is a position where, far from Anthony Crosland's thesis that the government can impose its will upon the corporate world, to a degree we've moved to a position where the corporate world can impose its view and its will upon government. So message I'm wanting to share with this slide is that, again, inclusiveness is a feature of direct employee ownership. It's a feature of the social market, and inclusiveness in voting within the company through the shares that are owned by the employees within the company in which they work is another feature of that inclusiveness. Let's move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Now, this is absolutely key slide, and we're moving here on to the pure economics, the potential contribution to a vibrant national and international economy. So the key, I've said, and I've got a number of keys as we go through this presentation, direct employee ownership represents an economic variable which, like the other macroeconomic variables of inflation rates, the management thereof, interest rates, the management thereof, employment levels, exchange rates, balance of payments, it has the potential to act as a support mechanism for the wider economic and social needs of productive national economies and stable social environments, if only it is embraced by governments truly as an economic variable of influence. Now, note the macroeconomic variables that I attach it to, mighty factors like inflation rates and employment levels. If a government, in my view, embraces employee share ownership with a belief that it does represent a capacity to influence the economy as a whole, then I do believe there will be a dramatic impact, particularly on productivity. I've spoken at length at various forums over the last couple of years on productivity at the ESOP Centre Guernsey conference, at the Lord Mayor's event last week in London that Michael Mayanelli organised for the ESOP Centre. Also a number of articles, including an article on the Financial Services Club website on productivity and how that is the raison d'etre, if you like, for employee share ownership. But I've summarised here the macroeconomic benefits of working with direct employee share ownership when it's embraced in a major way by government, and that's what I'm always seeking to encourage. That's what I write to senior government figures about in the UK and the US in order to encourage them. And the term I give to it is the economic tripos of direct employee share ownership. You might call it the economic triumph or the potential triumph of direct employee share ownership. That one, it produces higher employment levels and an avoidance of redundancies. Two, it has the capacity to lower prices or at least stem the tide of rising inflation rates through the taming of the inflationary spiral. And three, it produces enhanced productivity through motivational and incentivized working. And indeed, within limited case studies, I have to emphasize, within limited case studies of samples of decent size, these elements do have evidence. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So, the share economy by Professor Martin Weitzman. I mentioned the two key economists from the States who've influenced our thinking as employee share scheme practitioners, and they are Louis Kelso and Martin Weitzman. I've spoken at length about Louis Kelso in previous webinars. It's a delight always to do so, given the profundity with which he approached the subject through his binary economics. And I've got a little slide later on which is going to just summarize a couple of points from his work. But in this presentation, let's say a few words about Professor Weitzman, passed away just a few years back. Monumental work before he moved on to talk about, well, he moved on actually into work of enormous gravity in relation to climate change and sustainability. But at the time when he was focused on profit sharing and employee share schemes, he wrote a book called The Share Economy. It was published in 1984, and it identifies a causal hypothesis that the use of variable profit sharing, and by implication wider direct employee share ownership, implies that all involved in business will have fluctuating income levels over a given business cycle. So essentially what he's saying is that if a company embraces profit sharing and direct employee share ownership as a basis for delivering part of the remuneration return to its employees, then there's going to be an opportunity for flexible labour costs. Now, if you've got flexible labour costs, what are the consequences? Well, the consequences are of a flexible wage bill that there's less pressure on the part of management to authorise redundancies should circumstances arise where redundancies would be the natural response. Instead of actually making redundancies, part or maybe all of that flexible part of the wage bill is not paid. That's a key advantage of working with flexible labour costs and fluctuating income levels, therefore. But secondly, what you're doing effectively is smoothing out the trade cycle, whether it be at a microeconomic level within a given business, or indeed at a macroeconomic level within a national economy. And so what this means is that the government doesn't have to resort to stimulation techniques in order to increase aggregate demand. And that means that without those stimulation techniques, there's less pressure for prices to rise. So this is very, very interesting economics indeed, that the consequences are that as well as avoiding short-term unemployment, inflationary pressures will be kept in check by the lack of an imperative to use fiscal and monetary measures to stimulate the economy. Now also bear in mind that we have the impact on productivity. The impact on productivity is very, very powerful. That if profit sharing and employee share scheme returns are delivered only once the productivity has been achieved, then you've got another element which is going to prevent inflation, or at least prevents inflation rising at such high rates, namely a damper on cost plus inflation. Okay, that the reward is only delivered once the productivity has been achieved. I'm getting a note from Ian that we're getting excellent questions coming in, so keep sending them. In the meantime, I'll just go on for the next 4 or 5 minutes. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So on this next slide, I'm saying something about the tax advantage schemes, which were introduced in the first instance from 1978. We've had a plethora of schemes introduced ever since. Prior to that point, employee ownership in the UK was known as the Quiet Revolution, lagging far behind the American initiatives, particularly in California in 1956, initiated by Louis Kelso. But in many ways now our schemes are far more advanced even than the American schemes. You know, we have our tax advantage schemes, previously called tax approved schemes. They have their tax qualifying schemes. The impact of cooperative working and improved industrial relations, again, a feature of direct share ownership, but also a feature of the social market economy. Better industrial relations, better cooperative working, ensuring that productivity is achieved, and indeed avoiding the disruption through strikes. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the contribution to enable capitalism to become a benevolent economic model. Direct employee ownership gives to the economic philosophy of capitalism a method of combining welfareism with wealth creation. So it stunts the brutality of capitalism to be solely concerned with wealth creation by enabling an element of welfareism to come into the equation. And this is achieved through its capacity to unite opposites, to resolve contradictions, to take apparent incompatibilities and to sustain them into an holistic whole. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, the concept of the social market. So I've got a key point here. Yeah. So I've already mentioned the work of Martin Weitzman. Lower unemployment, lower prices, enhanced productivity. They represent objectives in the pursuit of wealth creation, but they also represent objectives in the pursuit of welfare, do they not? Because if you've got lower employment, lower prices, and enhanced productivity, you've got fewer social problems, fewer disruption within social problems and within the law and order regime to have to deal with. Okay, it's anomalous and short-sighted to consider that one is mutually exclusive from the other. I've identified here the work of particularly the Christian Democrats in Germany in 1949 and the subsequent work and endorsement of their approach by the Social Democrats in 1959. I've picked out this quote from Jeremy Leeman's book. I think he's a very, very interesting political scientist economist. I think he's now based at Loughborough University. But in his book, The Political Economy of West Germany, 1945 to 1985, he talked about the deproletization and decentralization of the German economy. So by deproletization, deproletarialization, I take that to mean inclusiveness, and by decentralization, I take it to mean individual empowerment. That acts as a brake. That acts as a brake on any brutality which might exist within the competitive streak of capitalism. It devolves power. It ensures that one power can act as a brake on the other. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This also is about the competition element. And again, I've picked out Franz Bohm, not the military man Franz Bohm, but the economist and indeed German politician Frank Bohm, when he declared competition is the greatest and most congenial means of reducing power in history. You only need to invoke it, and it does the rest of the work by itself. Well, is that not what employee share ownership does? Direct employee share ownership, of course it does. It devolves power to multiple centres, namely all the individuals who are members of the employee share scheme arrangement, and so it builds in checks and balances into the system, which I think in that final paragraph there on that page, I talk about as the invisible hand, the equivalent of the checks and balances that you might find in the political system, such that Walter Bagehot talked about in 1867 in his book The English Constitution. Let's go to the next slide. There's more about the social market economy here. And the cooperative element. I've picked out a quote from the Dusseldorf Principles of the Christian Democrats, which talks about involving representatives of the workforce at factory level and in national supervision of economic life in order to achieve the essential trust of all strata. So we're identifying there the competition element of the social market economy, but also the cooperation element. And isn't that true also of direct employee share ownership? Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So, understanding the operation of the social market, a very, very powerful concept. It does have that invisible hand. It works through market principles rather than impositional dictatorship, and it works alongside employee share ownership. Where do we find it operating best? Did we find it operating best in America? Probably not. Employee share ownership operates there, but does the social market economy? To a degree. What about Europe? Well, the social market economy operates, but typically rate returns on employee share scheme participation are lower there than they are in the US and the UK. I would posit the view that maybe that fusion between social market economy and direct employee ownership works best if you're going to pick out any country, and all of them have limitations within the UK. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so yeah, we'll just step over to the next one. Thanks. Yeah. I think what I'm trying to say here in these slides is that look, we're not talking about some sort of Platonic type approach. We're talking about an Aristotelian self-enlightenment where people pursue their desires and their plans, but they realize that other people are pursuing their desires and their plans, and they respect that because they have the same share interest as they do. And so again, that's a break on the crude Darwinistic element that's often associated with competition. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. Right, Kelso, just finished with this. I'm 29 minutes past, so I need to finish with this slide. A few things about Kelso is binary economics. So he talked about labour and capital as equally fundamental, and therefore he developed this binary system of factors of production. That technology makes capital more productive than labour, but capital cannot work without labour, and therefore labour should receive, as well as the traditional earnings, the wages of capital. Earnings in the form of dividends and capital gain from share involvement. And fourthly, that direct employee share ownership enables unity and therefore the identity of interest. Kelso, alongside Weizmann, very powerful economists to follow. Marry that with the legacy in Europe and the social market economy, and we have a very, very powerful recipe indeed to recommend to governments. Thank you, Ian. Let's take the questions.
David, thank you very much. And if you can just go to the next slide and then the one after that, please, Lucas.
You want to say something about that? Oh, where are we? Sorry.
We're on questions and answers.
Sure, yeah. I have got a slide about entrepreneurship, which people can read at their leisure. I invite them to read it at their leisure. Some thoughts from me about entrepreneurship and employee share ownership. Entrepreneurship within the company for the employee share scheme participants.
Indeed. And one of the things I think we have an increasingly savvy audience with us, some of them people who regularly attend these specifically ESOP Center oriented webinars, and some people who've been coming to the many and varied webinars that we do through Zien and the Knowledge Miles Lord Mayor's lectures. The slides are all available online on the websites for you to pull down. And I do commend, in particular, David's slides. When I've done these webinars with David, his slides are really comprehensive, and they do comprise a learning pack of notes. And a lot of people have commented afterwards they find these packs of notes very, very helpful to them in planning things that they want to do. So thanks to everybody for sending in questions. We have several to get through. I'd like to start with one very specific question first. It comes from Stephen Blank, and he says, I'm an NXD on the operating board of a company that was sold a couple of years ago to an EOT. The seller is being paid off over a period of time by way of gifts from the operating company via the trust. And we've looked for a small amount of bank debt to enable investment in a solar power system, but find that banks have no understanding of the EOT, and they therefore regard that balance as a liability of the company. Have other people found this sort of problem, and is there a bank that understands EOTs?
Well, it's not, when you're introducing an EOT arrangement, it is important to contact your bank. And when I've introduced EOTs for companies, that there's a little sort of spiel, a one-pager that I bespoke to the client company, give it to them, and that explains to the bank what the EOT is all about. But you do have to educate the banks. There's no one particular bank brand that I found is thoroughly aware of how EOTs work. It's really dealing with the local bank that the client company deals with at the time. But it is an education process that you have to take the bank through, and you need to involve the good auspices of your consultant, as my clients do, in order to do that. I emphasise though that is a form of indirect employee share ownership, and in fact, it's not even employee share ownership. The employees never own the shares. They're shares owned by the trust on behalf of employees, and they deliver some form of profit share, but there's never dividends or capital gain accruing to the employees. What I'm emphasising in my thesis today on the connection with the social market economy, when I've talked before on the connection with social mobility and levelling up, when I talk about the connection with productivity, it's all about direct employee share ownership, where the employees have a direct interest, whether it be in the form of direct ownership or a direct share option.
David, thank you very much for that. And Stephen, thank you for your question. I have a very interesting question here from Clive Bullen. And to some extent, it's at variance with one or two of the things you were saying about the voluntary nature of all of this. He wonders, should some elements of share ownership be made obligatory for companies of a certain size? Possibly share options, possibly some sort of employee share ownership scheme. How do you feel about an element of obligation to do this type of thing?
So the approach that I've always taken is that I do support the approach taken by successive governments, from the Lib Lab Pact through Thatcher, Major, Brown, the coalition, which is to use tax as the bait to attract the interest of companies and their advisors. Once you've actually got them baited by the tax release, then the hope is that they see the commercial benefits of employee share ownership. With regard to making it obligatory, so back in 2005 to 2008, I was working with a group of South African companies, and I used to go down there from time to time into Johannesburg and Cape Town, where effectively, courtesy of the Black Empowerment movement, employee share ownership was obligatory, compulsory, legally compulsory. And a lot of companies actually resented it, the fact that it was imposed upon them rather than a choice of their own free will. In fact, I would say the majority of them actually resented it. So I think that to go down the compulsory route is not the best way to proceed. Now, you mentioned earlier about the EOTs. I do think that a condition for a company going into an EOT arrangement should be that they also introduce some form of direct employee share ownership, and that should be a condition of companies being allowed to do an EOT. But that's a long way away from the government making it obligatory for companies of certain sizes to introduce employee share ownership. So tax-based, I think, is still the route to go in order to attract the attention and the interest, and then the implementation of companies on employee share ownership.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question, Clive, and thank you for that. And David, thank you for your thoughtful answer. I could actually imagine a whole discussion panel around just that topic for 45 minutes, but I think that covers the question as asked extremely well. We have a question here. This is a sort of chairman's prerogative, but not the chairman today. The chairman from last week. Robert Pay is online. Is the chairman of the ESOP Centre at the moment, and he asks, to what extent could employee share ownership be a significant contribution to the UK's productivity deficit? This is one of my favourite questions as well. So,
well, massive.
Dave, love your thoughts on that one.
Massive. I mean, we have malaise in productivity in the UK, not just compared with the US, where we're streaks behind, an economy, of course, which responds virtually immediately to any stimulus which is introduced, the US. But we're behind Germany by around about 10%, behind France by about 5%. As I said in my talk just, our raison d'etre for employee share ownership, our reason to be, should be the contribution that employee share ownership can make to enhance productivity. And it makes it in a whole range of ways. It brings about cooperative working. It avoids strikes. You working with variable pay, and in the Weizmann model, you pay the reward once the productivity has been met. So you're not actually stoking up cost plus inflation by increasing wages before there's a corresponding increase in productivity. So in all sorts of ways, Robert, that there is a very, very powerful case for the linkage between employee ownership and productivity. And I encourage you to read my article that's on the Financial Services Club website on that very subject. Thank you.
David, thanks very much for that answer. It's one of the questions that are coming in. Some of them are very much in line with my favourite thoughts on this topic, or favourite questions on this topic. There's one here from Frank Moxon. And he articulates it better than I would have been able to articulate it as a question. In order to optimize the benefits for all stakeholders, how can employees be better educated about the benefits and responsibilities of share ownership?
Well, thank you, Frank. Yeah, I mean, you're right up my street there. You really are. Employee share ownership can't operate in a vacuum. You can't simply introduce an employee share scheme and expect the world to change, let alone your company. It needs to work alongside its sister policies. And its prime sister policies are first and foremost a communication program, whereby you're involving employees in understanding what's happening in their company, typically, let's say, on a quarterly basis, at the very least, maybe monthly, with key financial parameter positions shared with them, turnover, bottom line profit, rate of growth, cost control parameters. So communication's absolutely key, and with that, education. You should use the communication, the monthly or the quarterly communication, to remind them that they're members of the employee share scheme, to educate them as to what the employee share scheme is about. And indeed, my own personal view and my own experience is that employee share scheme works best when you have a plethora of compatible sister policies, training and development, meaningful performance review type arrangements, delegation of decision making, works councils, works committees, quality circles, suggestion boxes, away days, all these elements of inclusiveness and involvement which complement the employee share scheme. So look after the employee share scheme and it'll look after you, and you best look after the employee share scheme by surrounding it with all these compatible policies, friends, if you like, friend type policies to employee share ownership. And right at the heart of that is the communication and the education strategy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the question, and thank you so much for the answer. Just before I ask, we've got one more question, but just before I ask that question, just for everybody who was interested in that productivity paper that David mentioned, Juliet has popped it into the chat area, so you can pick up that link now before the webinar closes down, rather than hunt for it later. So if people want to just click on that link in the in the chat area. That will take you to that paper. But our final question today, and again, this is one, if someone hadn't asked it, I'd have probably asked something like it myself. So thank you, Susan, for the question. Do these principles apply as much to developing economies as they do to developed economies?
Well, thank you, Susan. Yes, absolutely they do. I think big about employee share ownership. Yes, it's wonderful to introduce employee share ownership into different companies, but I think big to a point where governments embrace employee share ownership as a variable on the same level as I talked about earlier of managing all the other macroeconomic variables, inflation rates, employment levels, etc. And I do believe that there is a very, very powerful win to be had by economies, whether they be developing or developed. Now, interestingly, last week at the Lord Mayor's event on employee share ownership, which our friend Michael Mayanelli introduced for the ESOP Centre, the current Lord Mayor of London. I was talking there, as indeed with various other of my colleagues, Damien Cornell and various others, about the linkage to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the capacity of employee share ownership to erode positions of inequality and indeed to create wealth for economies of any type on any continent of any genre. So yes, the principles apply as much to developing economies as they do to developed economies. And you might say that if you've got a developing economy, or indeed an economy which is even below developing, and there are some in the world, you've got a blank canvas to work on. So yes, I mean this was the main thrust of our conference last week at the Mansion House with the Lord Mayor's event, the linkage of employee share ownership to deal with the achievement by 2030 of those sustainable development goals, and in particular the erosion of inequalities around the world, not through social security benefits, but through the reward for hard work and endeavour. Exactly the same principle that we've applied in the UK and in the US. In the UK since 1978 and in the US since 1956.
David, thank you very much for that answer. Lucas, next slide, please. It only remains for me to do a few thank yous and say goodbye because we are now out of time. Once again, I would like to thank our sponsors and the members of the ESOP Centre for enabling us to put on this webinar and other webinars like it. Next slide. Here are the ESOP Centre people as well. Again, we wouldn't be able to do this were it not for the generosity and maybe even forbearance of our sponsors and members. Next slide, please. Just to remind everybody, there are lots of resources available to you if you are members or even if you are not members. So if you look at these links, they are on the slide pack, which you can pick up for the website and news pad and FS Club bulletins on all manner of topics, not just ESOP Centre. Next slide, please. And now just a reminder about what's coming up next. A lot of this is Lord Mayor's programme and some of it is Yen webinars. I can hardly wait for tomorrow's a tour of London's Science City, 1550 to 1800. As someone who is interested in both science and history, that webinar coming from the Science Museum will be particularly interesting. Then on Wednesday, there is a webinar on advanced nuclear and the key to clean energy transition. And Thursday, another rather favourite topic of mine, how will we be long? This is a talk about Long Player, the longest piece of music ever written. It's 1,000 years long. And it is a fascinating project and a rather fascinating piece of music as well. And then next week, looking ahead, personal reflections on using management insights from physics and economics to approach pressing societal challenges. So an awful lot for us to all think about there. My next thank you is to you, the audience, for being so attentive and coming up with so many questions. Really, really grateful to you all, whether you are attending live as you are this minute, or if you're attending this on catch up, which many of you will be doing. Thank you for coming along, and I hope you've enjoyed this webinar. The final thank you is to David, of course, Now that we're on a new platform with GoToWebinar, there's a little react button. I think everyone has it, whether you're on a computer or on a tablet. If you're on a computer, it's in the bottom left-hand corner. So you can give a little round of applause through the react button. So if people would like to give a little round of applause through the react button, I'm not sure how this is going to work, because I've never tried this before, but there are several people I can see them popping up with their rounds of applause. And I think if they're on tablets, you get the love hearts if you're on a tablet. But David, I think you're probably just seeing little rounds of applause.
Very sweet.
So that's the very high-tech way that we're thanking everybody now. So with thanks from the audience.
Thank you.
Do you like that? We look forward to seeing you all again very soon. So thanks to everybody, and goodbye.